What if the person holding your life in their hands doesn't kill you, but instead silently manipulates your entire perception for 7 years? From a criminological perspective, the actions of mafia boss Ruggiero represent the pinnacle of psychological control. He holds Isada's father's life contract, but never revokes it. He ignored her to the point where she began to doubt her own self-worth. And then he appeared like a savior when she was cornered. The victim mistakes this toxic overprotection for love, but worse, he seems to be hiding a bloody secret about the very night her father died.
This wasn't the master plan she cooked up, but it delivered a twisted kind of satisfaction. For 7 years, the guy treated her like she was invisible. In one identical room after another, he'd look right through her, a total blank. For 7 years, she swallowed her pride until tonight, when she decided to detonate a bomb by showing up with the wrong man. You could literally feel the air change. The silence got heavy, and for the first time in 7 years, he actually saw her. Not as a woman, but as a lit match next to a gas leak. He stalked across the room, snatched her hand, and his whisper was a declaration of all-out war. You messed up big time showing up with him. What she never got was that his years of silence were never about not caring. It was something way more toxic. By the time she figured it out, 2 brothers were in a cold war over her, a trophy they both wanted for some mysterious reason. One brother offered an escape that looked so perfect it had to be a trap. The other offered protection that felt exactly like a prison. This was never about love. It was about the secrets they were hiding and why they were being kept. I'm Lena, and this is just the intro. Chapter 1. The blue dress. She knew showing up was a massive mistake. She knew it while redoing her eyeliner for a second time, her hands steady while her insides were a wreck. In her Palermo apartment's reflection, she looked like a woman ready for anything. Inside, though, her brain was losing the argument with her gut. You are actually going through with this, Giada said from the bathroom door, her arms crossed in total judgment mode. She was her ride or die, the owner of a vintage shop downtown, and the only one who could read Isada's bad life choices like a book. Going through with what? She asked, faking it, while adjusting the blue dress that was basically glued to her body. Going to the annual Cavour ball with Ennio. Giada stepped closer, fixing a fallen strap on her shoulder. Isada, babe, this isn't you being brave. This is you declaring war with your cleavage. Isada stayed quiet. Her friend was 100% right, and saying it out loud would make the incoming chaos feel too real. The Cavour family ball was the peak of high society on Sicily's east coast. She'd been going since she was a little kid. First as the daughter of an insider, and later as the girl whose invitations were always a hot topic. The reason was simple: pride. The same wild, illogical pride that kept her going since she was 17 when her dad died and left her nothing but a name and a mountain of debt. 7 years on, at 24, she was still standing with the same steady hands and a will of iron. But she'd learned that dignity isn't just handed to you. It's something you have to fight for, clawing to keep it every single day until it's just a part of you, like a scar. Giada watched her in the mirror, no longer looking amused. Why Ennio Isota? The answer was so obvious it hurt. 7 years of Ruggiero Cavour looking through her like she was a ghost drove her to pull the one move that would force him to look, show up on his brother's arm. This whole thing was never about Ennio. It was about the invisible girl proving she was impossible to ignore. Because he asked me, she said, the click of her lipstick case ending the conversation. The car Ennio sent was a black, unmarked sedan that smelled like new leather. She took the ride by herself. Giada stood at the entrance, arms crossed, her final words hanging in the air. Call me if it goes sideways. Call me if it goes well too, because I'm not sleeping until I get the full story. The drive to the estate near Catania was just long enough to second-guess everything, but way too short to back out. The Cavour villa rose up from the hills like some kind of monster. It was a stone fortress lit by torches, surrounded by a parking lot of cars that killed any idea of a small party. This was a theater of power, and every detail screamed one thing. We are the Cavours, and you're here because we allow it. Ennio was waiting at the bottom of the grand staircase. At 27, Ruggiero's younger bro had a charm that was basically a weapon. A practiced smile, warm eyes, and a touch so gentle it felt fake. You look stunning, he whispered, offering his arm. His sincerity just a little too perfect. She took it, playing her part. As they walked in, the vibe of the room shifted, not with the noise, but with a sudden, coordinated silence. She felt all the eyes on her before she even saw their faces. They were curious, judging, calculating. In Sicily, arriving at this specific ball with a Cavour isn't a date, it's a public announcement. Donna Silvia stood by the fireplace with the posture of a queen who also hunts. The family matriarch, at 70, had a chilling elegance. She checked out Asada over her glass, not looking angry or surprised. It was worse. It was an appraisal, like she was deciding Asata's market value before she even knew she was for sale. She held her gaze for 2 seconds, then looked away, not giving in, just choosing a different fight for another day. Ennio led her through the crowd like he was born to do it. She let him steer, but her eyes were scanning, against her own will, for the one guy she swore she wouldn't look for. And then she saw him. Ruggiero Cavour was by the bar, glass in hand, owning the space just by standing still. At 31, the head of the Cavour family got respect without saying a word. He wore a black suit, no tie, and the family ring, a crowned lion with a dagger in its teeth, shined on his finger. His whole vibe screamed one thing: I am the danger that wears a fancy suit. He was perfectly still, his eyes locked on her. Isolda knew all of Ruggiero's looks, the one that saw through her, the one that actively avoided her, the one that treated her like furniture. But this one was new. It had weight, it had heat. It held something she couldn't name but could feel down to her soul. She didn't look away this time. She met his stare, pouring 7 years of silence into it, her mind yelling, "Look at me, finally, just look at me," beside her. Ennio's hand tightened on her arm. When she looked up at him, he was smiling. It was a smile that was totally dead in the eyes. It was the smile of someone who knows something you don't, as if her silent war with Ruggiero was exactly what he'd been planning all along. Before she could figure it out, the room's attention shifted again. Ruggiero was moving. He put his glass down and walked across the floor with long, steady steps that made people automatically get out of his way. Every step felt like an attack on the space between them. He stopped right in front of them, and the air got thick. Then he took her hand, pulling it from Ennio's arm with a finality you couldn't argue with, leaning in so close she could feel the heat coming off his skin. "You were wrong to come with him," he said, his voice a low rumble meant only for her. Her heart was beating like a drum against her ribs, the traitor. She yanked her hand back with the same force he'd used to take it and stared into the dark eyes that had made her invisible for 7 years. "And you were wrong to ignore me for 7 years. Chapter 2. What the silence was hiding. 3 days had passed since the ball, and Ruggiero Cavore had apparently decided the right way to make up for 7 years of ghosting was to be everywhere. On Monday, he popped up at the cafe near her studio, where she always ate lunch. He didn't come in. He just stood guard across the street, a dark shape leaning against a black car, arms folded as he stared at the building like he was trying to see its secrets. By the time she came out, he was gone, but the owner told her with a nervous smile that a man, both polite and terrifying, had asked if she ate there a lot. On Wednesday, a restorer at her Palermo studio mentioned a weird call. Someone asking about her schedule, her friends, her mood. The restorer thought it was worried family. Isotta knew better. On Thursday, the guard at her apartment building casually mentioned that a black sedan had been parked on her street every night since the weekend. She didn't have to ask whose it was. This wasn't Ruggiero protecting her. He was taking apart her world, and the line between that and protection was so thin, she could feel it on her skin but couldn't see it. But Ennio, bro was playing chess, not checkers. White peonies hit the workshop on Tuesday, a deep cut, a flower she doesn't even remember telling him she liked, skipping all the basic courtship moves. Wednesday, he calls for a dinner invite. Super chill, like they've got all the time in the world. Thursday, just a quick text asking how she's doing. His game was a masterclass in zero pressure, making you wonder what his angle even was. Ennio had this effortless vibe Ruggiero could only dream of, a warmth so real it was suspicious. And that was the tell. In the Cavour family, nothing is free, and kindness is just credit for a later shakedown. She breaks all this down for Giada over the phone, the stress giving her a killer migraine. Her friend goes dead silent, which never happens, processing the data dump before dropping a nuke of an analysis. The older brother is running surveillance. The younger one is running a courtship. She paused. My love, you're looking at either a romance or a Raiko case. Sometimes they're the same thing. A quick laugh because Giada is a savage who always gets to the point. But as the humor died, the real problem surfaced. The battle wasn't Ennio versus Ruggiero. The real war was internal, a throwdown between what she felt she was owed and what she actually wanted. Two things that seemed totally incompatible. By Friday, she'd buried herself in the atelier. It was her fortress, with ancient stone walls that blocked out the Sicilian heat and the world trying to tear her apart. She was busy restoring some 17th century artifact, a job that required a stillness she could only find when everything outside went quiet. Then, after an hour of pure silence, the door swings open without a knock, the signature move of a man who never asks for permission. Ruggiero's presence just warped the room, making the workshop shrink around him. His sleeves were rolled up, a rare look at his forearms that felt like a crack in his usual ironclad armor. I saw that sliver of skin as a glitch in his impenetrable system. His eyes did a quick tactical sweep of the place, a move made for sizing up crowds, but tonight it was all focused on me. Your shift ended an hour ago, he stated, basically claiming he had a right to know her schedule. Was that a report from your spy or a new clause in my contract? My eyes stayed locked on my work. My hands were steady, but my entire body was screaming red alert. He stepped over the threshold, and the click of the lock sealed them inside. The studio, normally huge, suddenly had no air, and his presence was a tidal wave of claustrophobia. He moved like a predator, his eyes taking inventory of every single tool before landing on me from 6 feet away. The silence between them was thick and humming with a sharp, metallic energy. I put my tools down and turned. The pretense of working was a lie my body just couldn't sell anymore. Spit it out, Ruggiero. To talk. You don't talk. You issue commands and let the silence beat people into submission. The tiniest hint of a smile ghosted his lips, a micro reaction I hated myself for catching. An accurate assessment. I know. I braced for impact. What's different? He closed the gap between them, forcing me to shift my feet, pulling the invisible wire of tension even tighter. You were with my brother, he said, his voice tight but failing to hide something raw underneath. He invited me. You didn't. The shot landed. I watched his jaw clench, a storm brewing in his eyes. Ruggero Cavalli was a guy who couldn't handle a script he didn't write himself. I had my reason, he ground out after a silence that lasted 3 of my own panicked heartbeats. Reasons don't keep you warm at night, Ruggero. The words just fell out, heavy with years of unspoken history and manufactured distance. They were the result of a long, lonely war to kill a feeling that refused to stay dead. It hit him like a physical blow, a knife twisting between his ribs. For one insane second, I thought he was about to shatter all the rules of their dynamic, an act that would change the entire game. The moment was torpedoed by the appearance of Tassilo, who stood there poised for combat. As Ruggero's longtime enforcer, Tassilo was a man of few words and terrifying perception. His eyes sliced between us, analyzing our proximity and expressions with the speed of an operator disarming a bomb. I will be in the vehicle, Tassilo said flatly as he backed out. 2 seconds later, he popped his head back in, adding one word. Again. The door shut, and Ruggero let out a breath, clearly pissed as he took a step back. The explosive charge between us was diffused, but the fallout still hung heavy in the air. He shot me one last fiery look, a message so twisted with conflict I couldn't tell if it was a promise or a threat, before turning and leaving without another word. In the silence, I just stood there, my body shaking with a racing pulse for the first time in years. It took a full 20 minutes before I could get it together enough to call Giada, pressing my head against the cool stone wall with my eyes squeezed shut. After I finished the story, she was quiet for a record-breaking 3 seconds. Well, she finally said, if telling him reasons offer no warmth didn't get through his armor, nothing will. Go home. Tomorrow we strategize how to handle the man who thinks obsession is a courtship tactic. I ended the call, locked up the workshop, and walked the Palermo streets home, the ghost of his scent stuck in my head. The next day, Ennio suggested a quiet restaurant. He was picture perfect, immaculate suit, a killer smile designed to disarm. The conversation started easy. Him asking about my art and my life, a clinical masterclass in building a connection. The comfort he was selling was a beautiful, deadly trap. And then he made his move, a calculated shift in tone that screamed a planned attack was coming. He mentioned, super casually, that he knew about my father's unsettled blood debt. A jolt of pure adrenaline froze me solid, my hands locked in place as the world went silent. My entire universe narrowed down to his steady voice laying out a truth that was about to detonate my life. Don't worry, he said, his face calm, his eyes locked on mine. I have the means to erase it. Case File 3. The Blood Debt. I didn't get a second of sleep that night. Ennio's line, I have the means to erase it, just played on a brutal, endless loop in my head. Every instinct I had screamed that this offer wasn't an act of kindness. In their world, a gesture like that is always the down payment for your soul. I was back at the restaurant the next morning. Ennio was already there, looking so calm you'd think he'd planned my return down to the minute. like a guy watching the replay of a bomb he just set off. "You knew I'd come back," I said, skipping the pleasantries. "I was optimistic," he shot back, gesturing to the coffee. "Giving up isn't in your DNA." I ignored it. "Explain everything." Ennio then laid out the whole situation with the patience of a teacher and the cold precision of a lawyer. My father owed the Cavalli family a massive debt racked up before I was even a teenager. By the family's own messed up, unwritten laws, the price for that kind of debt was a life. For years, the debt had been dormant. Not forgiven, but not collected either. It was a permanent, unspoken threat, a loaded gun that any family member could decide to fire at any time. "And your solution is?" I asked, my voice barely holding together. "Marriage," he said, the word landing with the cold finality of a business merger. "To me, the union squares the books. You'd be safe, protected, and officially in the family, not just owned by it." I felt my chest cave in, the pure physical reaction to complete and total shock. She stared into Ennio's brown eyes, searching past the fake sincerity for the cold, manipulative math clicking away behind them. A hidden threat was coiled behind his gaze, perfectly camouflaged. "I'll consider it," she said, a tactical retreat disguised as thinking it over. When she told her friend Giada what went down, she could feel the secondhand terror through the phone. Giada's verdict was instant and brutal. "Isota. This is a corporate takeover, not a romance. Your life is not a commodity to be traded." The logic was flawless, but it couldn't even make a dent in the crushing weight of 24 years of inherited wreckage. That afternoon, she hits up Severo, the Cavalli family's old-school advisor, a dude who's seen it all for 70-plus years. In some dusty office that smells like history, he's waiting for her, probably already knowing her question. "The debt's legit," he says, case closed. "Who's holding the note?" She shoots back, and for the first time, Severo looks away. A tiny flinch she mentally screenshots. "That's a question for the boss," he says, shutting her down. But that shifty look, that was the key she just picked up. Night falls on Catania as she speeds to the Cavalli estate, dead set on getting the real story. Ruggiero is the only one who has it, but surprise, she's blocked the hall by Donna Silvia, the matriarch, in a total power move. The old woman's eyes are ice, sizing her up before she drops the verbal nuke. "You're not a boss's wife," she says, her voice colder than a morgue. "You're a debtor's daughter. Don't mistake his attention for your rank." Every word was a headshot to Isada's deepest insecurities. Every syllable just torpedoed the one thing she held on to, that she was more than her dad's screw-ups. Donna Silvia just pivots and leaves, not even waiting for a reply, dismissing her like she's nothing. Isada takes 3 seconds to get it together, then breaks all the rules and storms into Ruggiero's office unannounced. He's hunched over his desk, looking like he's carrying the entire world. When he looks up, his face softens for a split second. A crack in the armor she definitely noticed. "My father's debt," she says, skipping the pleasantries. "Who owns it?" Ruggiero hits her with a long, weaponized silence, his go-to intimidation tactic. After 7 years of being treated like air, she doesn't even flinch. "I do," he finally admits, and the words land like a judge's sentence. A shockwave hits her, but she stands her ground, refusing to let him see her break. The insane truth sinks in. Ruggiero Cavour had been secretly puppeteering her entire life. For 7 years, he had the power to totally destroy her. but instead just acted like she didn't exist. He looked right through her while literally holding the deed to her future. A sick, metallic rage starts climbing up her throat. It's a fury born from the massive plot twist that the guy causing all her pain was also her secret guardian angel. The contradiction completely short-circuits her brain, leaving her speechless. Her only move is to bail. She turns and walks out. In the hallway, Ennio is just standing there with a look that says he knows everything. He's got this fake pity face on, but his eyes are screaming checkmate. "Now you get it," he says softly, "about that alternative I offered." Cue Chapter 4, What No One Was Supposed to See, where she goes into total lockdown. She ghosts Rogero and Ennio, quits her job, and for 2 days, just marinates in pure rage. Giada's the only person she lets through the door. She rolls up that first night with wine, ready to just sit in the suck with her. When Isada finally talks, the story comes out in broken pieces, a total mess. Giada just listens, putting it all together. The messed up part isn't what he did, Isada confesses. It's not knowing if I should be grateful or furious, and trying to be both is tearing me apart. Giada just sits there, thinking on that psychologic. Her friend's diagnosis is a brutal take on Isada's life. It's a shield and a cage, she says, and that's the real horror. When something protects you and traps you at the same time, you completely lose your mind. This was a perfect picture of the mental chaos she was in, and right into this confusion, Ennio makes his move, taking a private debt and turning it into a public spectacle with a formal marriage proposal. By proposing publicly, he basically trapped her into saying yes. Donna Silvia gave her blessing, and Severo's silence was as good as a signature. In less than 48 hours, her life became a pawn in a power game. Rogero's counterattack was a masterclass in silent warfare. He dodged a direct fight and instead started surgically dismantling Ennio's power base, killing his contracts and seizing his assets. The beef between the brothers went from personal to business, with her as the unspoken jackpot. On the third night, Isota's simmering rage finally boiled over. She had to get in Rogero's face and force him to give her a straight answer for once. She finds him in his study, and the dude is clearly stressed. His tie's gone, his eyes are wrecked, and there's a glass of whiskey right there. When she walks in, he looks relieved for a hot second before his poker face snaps back on. "You vanished," he says. "You lied to me," she snaps back, "for 7 years. "I didn't lie, I omitted. Same difference when the silence is this loud." He turns his back, totally on the defensive. She can see the tension in his shoulders. "Why buy the debt?" she asks, her voice low and heavy. "Isada, why?" He spins around, and for the first time, she sees his perfect facade completely crack. The big bad Cavour boss is gone, replaced by a broken man. "Because if any other man had bought it," he says, his voice raw, "you wouldn't be here now. You'd be in his house, with his name, living a life that was never yours." It's a tactical nuke, reframing his control as some kind of rescue mission. She needed the raw truth, not the family-approved spin. Tears are stinging her eyes, but she refuses to cry, biting her cheek so he won't see. "Was your way really any different?" she challenges, her mood shaking a little. "You trapped me in a prison of ignorance. That's not protection, Rogero, that's ownership." Her words hit the bullseye. He winces, shutting his eyes as his jaw clenches. When they open again, the crack in his soul is a canyon. Rogero walks toward her. She doesn't move, not out of bravery, but because she's totally frozen. He gets so close she can feel the heat coming off him. He leans down slowly, pressing his forehead against hers. With his eyes closed, his shaky breath hits her lips. He smells like smoke and a deep, bone-crushing exhaustion, like the 7-year secret took everything out of him. I know, he breathes, packing years of regret and longing into 2 words. She was right on the edge of giving in, of taking the comfort she desperately wanted when the office door gets kicked open. It's Tassilo, his sharp eyes taking in the entire scene instantly. The 2 of them, foreheads together, no space between them, the air thick with drama. But his face screams a new kind of emergency. "Boss," he says, his voice completely flat. It's a full-blown alarm. The tension in the room could snap a steel cable. Ennio is in the hall. He has a priest. The words explode in the room. Ruggiero reels back like he's been shot, his face pure, unfiltered shock. He looks from Tassilo to her, and the vulnerability vanishes, replaced by a cold, dangerous calm. Ennio just showed his hand, using the church to force a public showdown. Ruggiero, the master strategist, was just boxed in by his own brother. Watching him, she knew his next move was a total mystery. He could play by the rules and sacrifice her, or he could start a war to keep her. While he's doing the mental math, she's stuck in the study, a silent prize in a war between brothers, with 0 say in her own future. Chapter 5. The Public Showdown. The grand hall of the Cavour mansion was set up for an execution, not a chat. Chairs were arranged in a semicircle filled with family members looking like statues waiting for a verdict. In the center stood Ennio, a priest by his side, rocking a perfect smile like her yes was just a formality. So the summons didn't even mention a ceremony, just formal meeting regarding the debt, dropped off by Tassilo himself. Dude lingered at her Palermo door for like 2 seconds too long, holding the envelope out like it was radioactive. His face wasn't just reluctant. It was the face of a guy who knows the plot twist and is dropping just enough hints to say, "I told you so," later. He almost said something, then choked it back to just, "Be careful when you read it." She figured it was just standard mob procedure. She drove to the Catania estate in a basic dress, her panic on lockdown, expecting to argue over spreadsheets and legal garbage. She really thought the final call would be hers. But then she walks into the hall, sees the priest in his gear, the whole crowd staring at her, and Ennio rocking a victory smirk, and that whole fantasy just evaporates. It wasn't a clean break. It was her certainty slowly dissolving, like realizing you've been in a trap the whole time and the jaws are closing. Donna Silvia was posted up in the front row. The Cavour matriarch was, as always, an absolute statue of composure, draped in dark silks, perfect hair, hands clasped like a queen who doesn't need to say a word to own the room. The family ring, a psycho lion with a dagger, was gleaming on her finger, a big fat symbol of the club she'd never get into. The matriarch's posture was a silent command, radiating the deep satisfaction of a perfectly laid plan clicking into place. Ennio took 2 steps forward. His smile was a weaponized charm offensive, his voice disarmingly soft, like he was about to hand over a winning lottery ticket. "Isata," he started, opening his arms in a fake welcome that was really a wall. "Thanks for coming. I'm here to talk about the debt," she shot back, her voice way colder than she meant it to be, her whole body already screaming danger. "Oh, we'll get to that," he confirmed, conducting the room like an orchestra. Ennio laid out his proposal with slick, polished spin, framing this ambush marriage as the most noble way to fix a debt he claimed she shouldn't have to carry. He threw around shiny words: honor, protection, tradition, unity, arranging them like jewels to build a cage that was almost impossible to say no to. Her father's blood debt would get zeroed out by their marriage contract. She'd be absorbed into the Hafiri clan, getting their official protection. The stain that had followed her name since she was a kid would be publicly washed away within a month. "My proposal is simple," he announced to everyone, his confidence off the charts. "This marriage settles the debt and secures our family's honor. Isota is no longer a debtor's kid, but a Kavuri wife. The books are balanced. Tradition is respected." Donna Sylvia just tilted her head. The move was tiny, almost invisible, but it landed with the force of a judge's gavel. The matriarch had given her blessing, a power move in the Kavuri world that only the Don himself could challenge. A quick scan of the room confirmed one unified vibe. "This is how it's done. This is your job. Get with the program and stop being a problem." "What are the terms?" she asked, a last-ditch effort to buy time as her world crumbled beneath her feet. Ennio rattled off the deadlines and clauses with the cold, detached air of a lawyer reading a will. "And if I say no?" she fired back. The room went dead silent, the air so thick you could choke on it. With a patronizing tilt of his head, Ennio's soft voice became a blade. "The debt still stands, Isota, and the person holding it can collect by any method they think is right." The threat was crystal clear, wrapped in the smooth delivery he used for all his commands, especially the violent ones. The family's shared looks became a silent jury delivering a verdict that was decided hours ago. I was the last one to get it. My own voice was just part of the show. My eyes locked on the main doors, the dark, heavy wood Ruggiero had walked through a million times. His heavy walk, the sound of a guy carrying the world alone, wasn't there. The doors stayed shut, he wasn't showing up. The black hole that opened in my chest wasn't shock, it was confirmation. It was that special kind of torture where you fear the worst, hope you're wrong, and get proven right. Ruggiero was a no-show. The guy who once put his forehead against mine and whispered, "I know." The guy who bought my debt just to protect me. The same man who walked across a packed ballroom to take my hand right out of his brother's. That guy was gone, and his absence was a bigger statement than anything Ennio had said. I opened my mouth, not sure what would come out. A fight, a question, or the kind of silence that means you've already surrendered. The priest gave me a look of holy pity. Donna Sylvia watched with the patience of someone waiting for the sun to set, and Ennio held my gaze with the calm confidence of a king who knows he's already won. In that beat of silence, the side door exploded open, smashing against the wall like a gunshot. Giada blew into the hall, moving like she was running from a fire, the only person acting on pure instinct. Her dark hair was a mess, she was breathing in ragged gulps, and her eyes were lit with the kind of rage you only see in people who love someone enough to do something crazy. Tassilo had called her. The quick look she shot at the door as she moved confirmed it. A flash of understanding between co-conspirators. And the thought hit me, a sharp rock in my shoe, even as relief washed over me. The same guy who handed me the invitation, knowing exactly what it was, also set up my rescue. He could have just told me. He could have leveled with me on my doorstep that morning, instead of letting me walk into this ambush expecting a business meeting. He didn't. He chose a strategy that kept my friend safe, protected his own ass, and led me straight into the trap. I tucked that piece of the puzzle away. Another weird detail to figure out when the whole horrifying picture became clear. Giada blew past every VIP in the room. She walked by captains like they were props. She strode in front of Donna Sylvia without even flinching and stopped next to me. A fortress of worn clothes, a killer wit, and a loyalty that couldn't be bought. "If you agree to this garbage," she hissed, her grip on my arm hard enough to leave a bruise, "I will physically haul you out of this place myself." My eyes started to burn. The knot in my throat got so tight I thought I was going to pass out. Not from fear, not from sadness, but from relief. The massive comfort of knowing that in a room full of power plays where my life was being traded like a stock, someone showed up just for me. Not for profit or strategy or duty. Giada was here because I was her person and she was mine. A bond deeper than any other. No vows, no papers, just the choice to show up when everyone else has bailed. I squeezed her hand back, and then the main doors swung open. Ruggiero didn't rush. No one announced him. No dramatic entrance. He just crossed the threshold, and the entire room's gravity tilted, everyone shifting like a new force field had been switched on. Family members sat up straighter, a reflex that happened before they even knew who they were seeing. The priest took an automatic step back, pressing himself against the wall, driven by a primal urge to get away from a predator his brain hadn't even registered yet. Donna Sylvia's gaze sharpened into a razor's edge, sizing him up, calculating if this was an act of war or just him being a problem. Ennio stood frozen, the first crack appearing in his perfect smile, a tiny twitch at the corner of his mouth. Ruggiero's focus was locked forward, his eyes skipping right over me, his mother, the priest, and all the powerful suits who were just window dressing. He walked with one single purpose toward his brother, closing the gap to just 3 feet, the difference between them suddenly on full display. Their eyes met, and the silence that followed was heavy with all the things you can never take back. Ennio held his stare, a performance of bravery I totally understood, because meeting Ruggiero's eyes right then was like staring into a blast furnace and praying the glass doesn't melt. Ruggiero's voice was low, but the dead silence in the room made every syllable echo like a royal decree shouted in an empty town square. "She will not be your wife. I hold this debt. I hold this power, and my answer is no." The entire chamber held its breath. I saw Donna Sylvia's hand clench the arm of her chair, physically fighting an impulse. I saw Severo close his eyes for a second, the exhausted resignation of a man who hears the first crack before a building collapses. I saw the priest's eyes dart to the exit, his face a frantic map of an escape he couldn't possibly make. Ennio's smile was still there, but it had changed from friendly to fatal, its warmth cooling into the razor-thin edge of a freshly sharpened knife. "That's her call to make, bros," he declared, pivoting to Isa with a grand gesture, a power play to snatch back the control Ruggiero just took. Suddenly, both their gazes were on her, then the whole room's. She felt that collective stare like a physical weight, crushing down on her, trying to make her collapse and let someone else decide. Giving in would be easy. Just agree, sign the paper, take the name, and get swept along with the flow. This was what the room wanted. This was what tradition demanded. It was the same path generations of women before her were forced to walk. Take the deal and stay quiet. Giada's hand squeezed hers, a quick, tight grip that didn't ask for anything but offered everything. A silent message. "I'm your rock. You're not alone in this. Do the right thing." Isa's eyes then found Ennio, the architect of this golden prison he called a safe haven, a dude who saw her debt as a stock option and her body as the collateral. He shot her a look that might seem warm to an outsider, but in this high-stakes production, it was just another tool for his polite, greedy ambition. Then she looked at Ruggiero. He stood 10 feet away, same old posture, but his shoulders were wound tight with a brand new tension. Not power, but pure anticipation. His eyes, though, were completely changed. No more commands, no more strategy. They were stripped clean of that cold armor she'd always mistaken for not giving a damn. What she saw in them shook her more than anything else in that room. It was vulnerability, total, raw, and completely defenseless. The quiet panic of a man who was, maybe for the first time, facing a total loss of control. He wasn't the player anymore. He was the piece. He was just waiting, and this powerless state was hitting him harder than any war he'd ever fought. Ruggiero Cavour, the boss, the myth, the man whose silence moved armies, was standing right there, totally exposed, waiting for her judgment. And in that wild reversal, she finally understood something he might have known all along. Love isn't the opposite of control, it's the act of giving it up. She took a deep breath. The air felt different, clean, and with it came a shocking moment of clarity. It was sharp and pure, totally free of the rage that had been fueling her and the fear that had frozen her. In their place was something way more fundamental and a hell of a lot stronger: resolve. She knew what she was, not a product, not a line in a contract, not a pawn in some family drama between brothers. She was Issa de Ferry, a woman who fixed what other people tossed out, who had her own self-respect, and who was now staring down men completely lost when faced with someone refusing to play their assigned role. "My father's debt is not my problem," she announced, her voice shockingly steady, built from 24 years of buried feelings and practiced cool. "I am not property to be traded." She then let the silence drag on, owning it, using it as her first real power move. For once, the silence was hers. She refused to be the one to break it. "But if I decide to make a deal," she continued, her eyes locking onto Ruggiero's, "then I will be the one who chooses the man, and I will be the one who sets the terms." "You could have heard a pin drop in that chamber." She held Ruggiero's gaze, which after years of him looking away, was now clinging to hers with the desperation of a man terrified of losing it all. Her voice was low, meant just for him, but the message was an absolute ultimatum. "On my terms, Ruggiero." His stare lingered, a silent admission of their entire unspoken history. His answer, when it came, was a raw whisper, a surrender that cost him more than any battlefield loss. "On your terms." And we roll into Chapter 6, the aftermath. There was no big dramatic explosion, no shouting, no applause, none of the huge release you'd expect from a moment like that. What happened wasn't loud, but it was a tectonic shift. The entire power dynamic in the room got fundamentally rewritten. The onlookers were struggling to process this paradigm shift in real time. The patriarch of the Cavour family, a guy known for his iron-fisted authority, had just bent the knee to a woman their world had systematically muzzled. Donna Silvia stood up, her movements sharp, every action a calculated response. Her gaze didn't land on Ruggiero or the woman who had just won. She walked out with an icy grace, her back ramrod straight, every step on the marble a sharp crack. A sentence that was just postponed, not forgotten. Ennio processed his defeat. The only signs were a clench of his jaw and a look that was now pure, cold calculation. The friendly guy mask had cracked, revealing the strategist underneath, who was already recalculating his next play after losing this round. He adjusted his cuff like a robot, gave the priest a short nod, and vanished through a side door, never once looking back. That exit was more terrifying than any open threat, because while you can measure anger, Ennio's quiet scheming was a much deadlier kind of poison. Severo let out a slow breath, releasing all the tension from the showdown. His eyes flicked between Ruggiero and her, a spark of relief lighting up the old advisor's face. He looked like a lighthouse keeper who'd just seen a ship make it through a killer storm and find a safe port. As soon as the room was clear, Giada pulled her into a brutal hug. It wasn't for comfort, but a massive, crushing move meant to force out both air and all the feelings she'd been holding back. The trembling in Giada's shoulders showed her tears had already started. A classic move, since she always felt the other's pain with a rawness the woman herself refused to show. "You told an entire family off!" She breathed into her shoulder, her voice thick with emotion, every word dripping with a pride that felt intensely personal. "I have never been prouder." The response was a short, shaky laugh full of unshed tears, less about being happy and more about releasing an insane amount of pressure, a feeling way too complicated for that moment. Understanding just how big her actions were would have to come later, in bits and pieces. She framed Giada's face with her hands. "Thank you for being here." "Always," was the reply. One word that was a promise of fierce loyalty, a bond stronger than the Cavouri name, the debt, or any man. Giada pulled back, wiped her eyes on her sleeve, and declared she needed wine and a month-long vacation. She left with the raw honesty of someone who feels things without apology. And then she was alone, standing in the center of the empty hall, the air thick with the ghost of snuffed-out candles and choices you can't take back. She felt the solid beat of her own heart and a weird, grounding weight, as if the floor she was standing on was finally hers. Ruggiero's walk wasn't his usual predator's stalk. His steps were slow, careful, as if the space between them was now sacred ground. "You came," she said, her voice softer than she meant it to be, the relief of seeing him breaking through her last wall. "I almost didn't," he shot back, the raw honesty of that hitting harder than any sweet talk. "Why?" He stopped, close enough for her to feel his heat, but far enough to hang on to the last shred of pride he was already giving up. Because his being there was a choice, and that choice meant giving up an empire he'd spent a lifetime building. His eyes did a slow scan of her face, the intense focus of a guy memorizing something priceless he was scared to lose. "But not coming here meant losing you. At the door, I decided nothing I owned was worth that." The whole vibe between them changed. The high-stakes political tension evaporated, replaced by a way more explosive, quiet force, the raw, magnetic energy that had always been their secret language, an instinct they had both epically failed to suppress. She didn't say a word. None was needed. For the first time in her life with Ruggiero Cavouri, their connection wasn't about debt or duty, but about a mutual, broken, and massive choice. They walked out the main doors into the warm Sicilian night, the air thick with the smell of jasmine and salt. On the hills, the estate's lights looked like fallen stars, while from the mansion, muffled noises hinted that order was being restored after the chaos. They walked through a torchlit garden, and the quiet that fell over them was different from any quiet they had ever shared before. It wasn't his typical silence of being guarded and distant, nor her silence that came from self-defense. It was a shared space, shaky and heavy with unsaid history, yet for once it wasn't built on lies. Then he stopped. When he turned to her, a nearby torch threw one side of his face into light and the other into shadow. A perfect snapshot of Ruggiero Cavour's whole deal. "Do you want the truth?" he asked. His voice had a new sound to it. Fear, not the tactical fear of an enemy, but the vulnerability of a man about to make a confession with no clue what the verdict will be. All of it. A breeze blew the scent of lemon trees between them, like it was trying to wash away the ghosts of their last fight. She watched him, his dark eyes, after 7 years of looking straight through her, were now locked on her, as if she had the answer to a question he was too scared to even ask. Her words confirmed the one thing she had always needed, and he had always denied her. It's the only piece that was ever missing. Chapter 7. The Speaking Silence. The Cavour estate had a terrace she had never seen after dark. It was on the villa's east wing, jutting out over a waterfall of olive groves that rolled down toward the sea. From that spot you could see the coastline of Catania, a shimmering mirage on the horizon. Ruggiero led her up a cramped stone staircase without saying a thing, so narrow they had to go single file. He took the lead and she trailed behind. The 30-step journey was just enough time for her to process that this dude just torched his entire world for her, a bombshell her brain hadn't even started to compute. The terrace was basic. Old stone, a mossy railing, and 2 iron chairs that looked older than his family's dynasty. A big moon lit the scene with this surreal blue glow, making it feel totally timeless. He just put his hands on the wall, staring into the black water. She stood back, arms crossed like a shield. Her heart was hammering against her ribs, a full-blown physical sign of major stress. The silence between them wasn't angry, just heavy, like the air before a huge battle where everyone knows the world's about to change forever. He started talking. 3 different crews put in a bid for your debt, he said, his eyes glued to the horizon. His voice was deeper, stripped of its usual mob boss authority, like he was intentionally powering down. She didn't move a muscle, didn't say a word. 2 of them were going to use you as a bargaining chip. His jaw clenched at the word collateral, a quick flash of total disgust. The 3rd would have sold you off to the Ferranti syndicate. To them, people are just assets. Their methods would have been exactly what you'd expect. She cut in, I know you were the one who bought it. Then she hit him with the question about the years of radio silence. He finally turned, his face carved out by the moonlight. Because they would have used my feelings for you as a weapon. That confession hit her like a punch to the gut, cracking the emotional walls she'd spent years building. You disappeared, she said again. But it wasn't a question anymore. It was a full-blown accusation. His confession hung in the air, spelling out his brutal code. Feelings are a weakness, and weakness is a death sentence. I understood the cold-blooded math, but it couldn't dent the armor of pure resentment his own logic had created in me. You kept your distance, I said, for 7 years for my safety. To guarantee your survival, he shot back. And you thought that was good enough. A little shake on that last word revealed the wound I was trying to hide. The damage was obvious. So for me to be preserved, I had to completely cease to exist? Ruggiero paused for a beat before he answered. He stood perfectly still, his stare so intense it felt like a physical pressure on my skin. The look on his face was a raw confession of his guilt, more convincing than any apology ever could be. He finally understood the massive scale of his screw-up, that his brand of protection had been a 7-year sentence of forced isolation and the soul-crushing fear that I meant nothing. This new awareness was like an open wound on his face. Every single time I had to look right through you, he admitted, his voice quiet and close, I would come back to this spot. I'd watch the water and just believe that someday you would get to hear all of it. I'd find you, look you right in the eye, and tell you that every single moment of that silence was a war that cost me more than any battle I've ever fought. A gust of wind blew a piece of her hair into her eyes. Before she could even react, Roggiero's hand came up, hesitating for a split second, like he was breaking a rule he'd lived by his whole life. His fingers gently tucked the hair back, a tender move totally out of character for the man she knew. The touch sent a shock of pure electricity from the base of her spine straight to her neck. He didn't pull his hand away. His fingers then started to trace her jawline, slowly mapping out a place he had only ever watched from a distance. His thumb came to a stop at the corner of her mouth, the pressure as light as a whisper. I lost 7 years, she said, her voice sounding thin and strange. 7 years? That could have been hours. I know. I honestly thought you didn't even see me. I saw everything, he said, and the words hit her with the force of a tidal wave. I saw you walk into rooms and pretend I wasn't even there. His anger wasn't just some simple fire. It was pain that had been twisted into something else entirely. He described watching Asada's hidden misery, the fake smiles and quick exits from parties, as a series of hits he took personally. The sharp sting of his own rejection had morphed into a deep, painful empathy for her. This was the rage born from stolen time, from a torture they had both shared in silence. He had been communicating in the only way his world permitted, through a protective silence designed to shield her from the very danger that he was. She then changed the whole game with a statement that wasn't a request, but an order. He would never, ever treat her like she was invisible again. This was the first time she used the power he'd just publicly given her. His response, never again, was delivered like a sacred oath. While her brain screamed for more questions, a gut instinct took over. All that mattered was his lingering warmth and a closeness that had become a force of nature, the complete opposite of their long-running pain. It was the official truce between two souls who had finally laid down their weapons. Their kiss could only be called a mutual surrender, an unavoidable closing of a space that was always fated to disappear. There was no frenzy or desperation, just the slow, unstoppable pull of a story reaching its long overdue ending. His touch was shockingly gentle, a massive contrast to the ruthless gangster he showed the world. This wasn't him winning a prize, but him completely giving up, a man finally breaking before the one force he could never beat. His hand moved to her neck, tangling in her hair, tilting her head back in a firm, possessive claim. The kiss immediately shifted, no longer a soft surrender, but now blazing with a ravenous heat born from years of starvation. He tasted of rich wine and warmth. His arms became steel bands around her waist, smashing their bodies together. The solid fact of his body, the raw power of his hold, and the primal scent of his skin threw her entire world into a tailspin. It was a complete free fall, and he was the only solid ground beneath her. He pinned her against the cold stone wall of the terrace, the jarring chill against her back fighting the inferno of his body, forcing a quiet gasp out of her. Ruggiero broke the kiss, locking his eyes with hers with an intensity that felt like a physical force. "If you want me to stop," he said, his voice ragged, "now is the time to say so. My self-control is about to snap." In his eyes, the same eyes that had avoided hers for 7 years, she saw hunger not just for her body, but for her entire being. It was the desperate plea of a man who has found his only light and is terrified it's about to be snuffed out. "I have waited 7 years," she whispered, her hand flat against his chest, feeling the chaotic beat of his heart under his controlled exterior. "Don't you dare stop now!" A raw, guttural sound of defeat was ripped from his throat. A vibration she felt right before his mouth crushed hers again. Any hint of gentleness was gone. He devoured her lips with a ferocity that slammed her into the wall, his hands mapping her spine in a move that was both a prayer and a demand. She clung to his rigid, trembling shoulders, killing any space between them, because now it was unbearable. His hand found the strap of her dress, pushing it off her shoulder with agonizing slowness. The rough scrape of his calloused fingers on her skin was proof of a restraint that was stretched to its breaking point. His mouth followed, tracing a slow, burning path down her neck, setting every nerve on fire. He explored the curve of her throat, pausing over her pulse as if memorizing its frantic rhythm. His hot breath against her skin made her arch back into him. His lips landed where her neck and shoulder met, a constant grounding presence while his hands gripped her waist. His body was a firm, relentless pressure. His hips began to move in a slow, deliberate rhythm. This was friction through their clothes, a promise of what was to come, building a deep, pulsing heat between them. He murmured against her skin the words a secret vibration. "For all this time, I kept away, never imagining you could miss someone you never truly had." She squeezed her eyes shut, weaving her fingers into his hair, feeling him surrender to her touch as if it were the absolution he'd been waiting for. The entire dynamic between them had been completely obliterated. A man who ruled his universe with absolute control was now totally unraveled, his closeness a screaming testament to his shattered defenses. His surrender wasn't a sudden collapse, but the slow, definite decay of a fortress he had built over years. The real intimacy between them wasn't in one single action, but in the moments in between. In the uneven breaths, the trembling touches, and the unspoken pressure that communicated a deep, soul-level need. As the world slowly sharpened back into focus, she found herself crushed against him, her ear tuned to the wild drumming of his heart. He clung to her like she was the only stable thing in a world he had just permanently upended. Nothing else registered. "Don't shut me out again," she commanded in a low voice. "Never again," he answered, the words a raw promise. He drove the point home by tightening his grip, his breathing finally calming down. As if he were branding her as his own, they held on tight as night fell. In a world of snakes, she was his only truth. She finally gave in, realizing this wasn't weakness, but completion. Chapter 8. The Morning Shadow. But then she woke up, alone. He was gone. Outside, a deadly calm had settled over the estate. They just called a truce, a fragile peace replacing silence. But then she spotted it. Tassilo, casually chatting with their sworn enemy, Enio. The sight sent ice through her veins. A friendly meeting with a rival? That's straight-up treason. She froze solid, a statue, until Tassilo saw her and instantly looked away. The ultimate tell of a guilty man. Ennio's crony slipped out a side gate. Tassilo started walking back to the house, trying to act normal. Though she was perfectly still, her heart started hammering with that old, familiar dread from her past. The peace she'd felt was real. The connection was legit. The memory of Rogerio's embrace, it was all true. She processed this new development with ice-cold clarity. Deep down, she's still the girl whose father was betrayed and left for dead. Life taught her that trust is a liability and peace is just the loading screen for the next disaster. Staring at the empty garden, she finally understood the real cost of loving Ruggiero Cavouri. It wasn't the shootouts, but the curse of never seeing a sunrise without searching for the demon in the dark. And that's our girl, Lena. This closes out Volume 1 of the breakdown. Volume 2 is locked and loaded. You can get it for a small archival fee. Their peace treaty lasted 3 weeks. 3 weeks beside Sicily's most feared man, before the Iron Curtain went back up. He started locking doors, giving her that look, the one that says she's about to be left in the dark. In the 4th week, she woke to a cold bed and a guard at her door. Ruggiero had vanished on some off-the-books mission. Then, a grainy photo hit her phone. It was her father smiling next to someone he should never have known. Below it, a single sentence: "Ask your husband what really went down that night." The war wasn't over. It had just moved to a new battlefield, and the secret was all his. As you can see, that was just a taste of Volume 2. To get the full, uncensored story, smash the premiere link into pinned file. I'll meet you on the other side. As a reminder, click that first link and you get the entire 2nd volume, 0 ads, 0 interruptions. It's that simple. The material in Volume 2 is next level intense. And for these who agree, there's more, where you'll find dives into even crazier dark romance. And because it gets so much more graphic, it's stuff that would get us booted from a platform like YouTube.